I think the Trump administration's warning to the Taliban is pretty much consistent with his America First policy slogan, where the question is that they shouldn't be spending money where it is not required. And one of the criticism of the Trump administration is that why are they giving millions of dollars to the Taliban regime? I think they will try to bargain with the prisoners exchange to convince the Taliban, the new Trump administration, not to suspend their aid. But also, if the Trump administration goes ahead and suspends the aid to Afghanistan, it will push Afghanistan closer towards China, Russia, Iran, these countries. So by doing prisoners exchange, Taliban are not going to get the diplomatic recognition. This is going to be a huge decision because if the US does it, then no country in the world will stay behind and they will recognize the Taliban regime. Now you have two examples. You have a government, Taliban-led government in Afghanistan, and then you have another group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is now has come to power in Syria. So if they recognize the Taliban regime, then they will have to weigh the pros and cons of whether they go down that path of granting diplomatic recognition to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's government in Syria as well, because that pretty much legitimizes the Taliban's agenda, their ideological narrative, and everything. So, since the Taliban have returned to power, the U.S. humanitarian assistance, which has been pouring into Afghanistan through different streams, they are helping through the UN, several other organizations. I think it has played a pivotal role in helping the Taliban to survive economically, because had Afghanistan, had the Afghan economy faltered, there would have been a refugee flow towards Europe, towards the US, and the entire blame of withdrawing from Afghanistan would have been criticized, and an economically unstable Afghanistan then would have become a breeding ground for different terrorist groups, especially the Islamic State of Khorasan and Al-Qaeda, which is there. So while the US was conditioned the recognition with, making up in politically inclusive government structure, incorporating other opposition groups, ethnic groups, other minority groups as well, granting women their right to work, girls their right to education. The diplomatic recognition was conditioned with that. But at the same time, US was quite aware of the fact that they should be giving enough to the regime through different channels that economically Afghanistan survives, and then there is no refugee flow towards Western countries, and it doesn't become a breeding ground for the terrorists. So keeping that in view, I think the Trump administration's warning to the Taliban is pretty much consistent with his America First policy slogan, where the question is that they shouldn't be spending money where it is not required. And one of the criticism of the Trump administration is that why are they giving millions of dollars to the Taliban regime, which is an oversimplistic take on part of the Trump administration. But then the question they're asking is whether the Taliban are going to return the weapons that US left behind in Afghanistan. Now, that's a more complicated matter in a sense that jet fighters and other, heavy weapon systems which were there in Afghanistan, jet fighters were flown to different Central Asian countries. They were parked there. And what was left in Afghanistan was mostly small and light arms and weapons. All the heavy, weaponry which was there, for instance, at the Kabul airport, they destroyed most of it. At the Bagram air base, they depleted them to a point where they were not usable. Yes, the Taliban have been able to repair some of them, but they're not war ready. So as far as the big arms are concerned and big weapon systems are concerned, they are not there. Can the Taliban return that they will be keeping an inventory of those weapons? So what as a result of that will happen if this is a pressurizing tactic by the Trump administration? What the Taliban will do is they will try to, show defiance as they have always done to these, external parts. At the same time, we are also seeing some reconciliatory gestures from the Taliban as well, such as the prisoners exchange. So I think they will try to bargain with the prisoners exchange to convince the Taliban, the new Trump administration, not to suspend their aid. But also, if the Trump administration goes ahead and suspends the aid to Afghanistan, it will push Afghanistan closer towards China, Russia, Iran, these countries. I think during the Trump administration, we are not going to see diplomatic recognition of the Taliban regime. But then Trump is a very unpredictable, a personality and a leader. So you can expect anything from him, but it's safe to assume that this is not going to happen. So the criticism which has been there, because if you look at the way Biden administration approached America's Afghan policy was pretty similar to what Trump was doing. Trump withdrew from Afghanistan. Biden continued with that. He kept Zalmay Khalilzad as the special representative for Afghanistan because there was this transition going on. So the policy has been consistent. So I think since Biden administration continued the policy of the first Trump administration of withdrawing, so pretty much it will be consistent, not according diplomatic recognition, continuing pressure to respect human rights, an inclusive political system, granting girls their right to education, women their right to work, and bring them in the public life. This criticism will continue to be there. They will condition the humanitarian assistance with some progress on these fronts. What the Taliban are going to do, I think they have, as I said, they have defied Western pressure, outside pressure in the past. They will do so again, but then they will get closer to the anti-US countries in the region, such as China, Russia, Iran. Taliban's strategic calculus will not be very much impacted by how Trump approaches them. Yes, initially they will, there will be some reconciliatory gestures from the Taliban as well, but then they will adopt a wait and see policy and see how much Trump means what he's saying. At times, Trump makes these announcements, but then whether he implements them or not is another question. So while Trump has said this, Taliban will wait and see to what extent he cuts the aid, because for now it is just a threat and a warning. He hasn't said that he is going to cut the aid. It is just a warning. So that means that Trump is also using it as a as a bargain tactic. So what does he want in return from the Taliban? We'll have to wait and see. So on human records, Trump won't bother much, despite keeping that pressure on the Taliban, which is a boilerplate response by any US administration towards the Taliban regime. Actually, what does the Trump administration want from the Taliban? It could be more cooperation against the Islamic State of Khorasan, more action against Al-Qaeda, squeezing space for China and granting more space to pro-US countries like India, Western countries maybe. So I think that those could be the realistic demands of the Trump administration. So he is using this threat as a bargain chip vis-a-vis the Taliban. So the Taliban, while giving some reconciliatory gestures vis-a-vis releasing some US prisoners, will wait and see what the Taliban's demands are. And mostly US, deals with the Taliban or contacts them through Qatar. So they will wait and, watch and will wait to hear what the demands are and whether the Taliban can, fulfill those demands or not. So it created goodwill. Trump, when he was talking to the Taliban, or his people were talking to the Taliban, so his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, signed the Doha Accord. So he was, he has good thing to say about the Taliban. He praised them, but the question of diplomatic recognition never arose. So by doing prisoners exchange, Taliban are not going to get the diplomatic recognition. this is going to be a huge decision, because if the US does it, then no country in the world will stay behind and they will recognize the Taliban regime. Now, you have two examples. You have a government, a Taliban-led government in Afghanistan, and then you have another group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is now has come to power in Syria. So if they recognize the Taliban regime, then they will have to weigh the pros and cons of whether they go down that path of granting diplomatic recognition to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's government in Syria as well, because that pretty much legitimizes the Taliban's agenda, their ideological narrative, and everything. So this is a more difficult and complex question. So I think while it will create goodwill in the Trump administration about the Taliban, but to get the diplomatic recognition, Taliban will have to do a lot more, which I have said before at the cost of repeating myself. An inclusive governing structure, giving girls their right to education, women their right to work, bringing them in public life, and holding elections, restoring democracy in Afghanistan. These are more difficult questions to maneuver. Taliban's worldview is antithetical to democracy. They do not believe in elections. They consider them as un-Islamic. So those are more difficult negotiations. So if this happens, the goodwill will be there. The Trump administration might reconsider the threat of cutting or suspending humanitarian aid to Afghanistan, but the question of recognition will linger on. So, of course, there are a lot of Afghans who are still stuck in different countries, in the UAE, some are in Pakistan, others are in different other countries who are still waiting for a decision on their application to be repatriated to the US. Now, if the Trump administration reverses that, these refugees, of course, will then you have no option but go back to Afghanistan. They could be facing life threats. Number one. Number two, if the policy towards the refugees changes, of course, it will put more pressure on a sluggish Afghan economy, which is pretty much dependent on the humanitarian assistance which is coming from the US to the Taliban regime. So it impacts, because remember, refugees are being repatriated forcefully from Pakistan to Afghanistan as well. So while Taliban have been able to deal with it, but it will put more pressure on them. And as far as their ability to govern is concerned, as far as their international standing is concerned, I think the international standing of the Taliban will definitely be impacted in the way they govern Afghanistan, because they promise people better governance, and they have been able to restore peace in Afghanistan. Given the difficulties, limitations, and challenges that they inherited, they haven't run the Afghan economy in a bad manner. They have done a decent job, but that will be impacted. With refugees coming in and Taliban, it will add a financial burden to the Taliban. But as I said before, the international community and regional states are dealing with Taliban as a de facto regime and a reality in Afghanistan, but not as a de jure government. So they will continue to be the de facto rulers of Afghanistan. They won't get the recognition. Yes, it will add to their economic challenges and financial burdens, but they have weathered such challenges in the past, and they will be able to weather the challenge that any challenge on the immigration front or the refugee front comes from the Trump administration. They will be able to weather it as well. Mind you, when these Afghans who were leaving, Kabul, other parts of the country, when the Taliban took over, most of them are middle class. They are professionals who were, were critical part of the democratic system in Afghanistan. So in case they are forcefully repatriated to Afghanistan, might not be a bad news for the Taliban, in a sense that these people will be able to, they will have their utility will be a value addition to the Taliban, who are struggling to find professionals to run the economy, governance, other systems in the country. if those people, unfortunately, if they are forced to return to Afghanistan, this workforce will help Taliban do better governance.